Good morning, everyone. So this is the recorded lecture that I promised you, to make up for my absence last week. So this lecture is going to be about syntagmatic relationships, so the way words are combined together along the syntagmatic axis. So we're gonna see three combinations, collocations, and idioms, and some theoretical underpinnings to that. So more precisely, we're going to see, as I said, some theoretical backgrounds. So we will cover some important figures in linguistics, both in the American and the British schools of linguistics, and what their relationship is with the study of context in general. Because of course, that context is what is where it's kind of the background against which like words are combined together along the syntagmatic axis. So of course we need to kind of establish what context is, and these schools they did quite a bit of work on context. So then of course we're going to see context, like few definitions of it, and also like senses, different senses of context, and we will see which one is the most relevant for what we are talking about today. Then we'll be moving on to the notion of valency that some of you might remember has to do with how many elements or arguments a verb can take or attract, and of course that's really relevant because it has to do with with again the syntagmatic axis, so the elements really gravitating around the central node that a verb is. And we still then go pretty theoretical by having a look at case theory and frame semantics. So these are some theories that basically open the way to cognitive linguistics. They were proposed by Charles Fillmore, and we will see how, in a way, they are related with this idea of syntagmatic arrangement. And then finally, we take a closer look at the really, technical but not too technical notions that I'm going to introduce in this lecture. The notion of collocation, combinability, and collocability. Of course, we will see that some of these terms are sort of synonymous, especially combinability and collocability, which we also call collocational range. But of course, more on that later on during this lecture. And then we take a look at idioms and also the encyclopedic knowledge that is needed to understand and use idioms. And finally, we kind of cover a bit of history of corpus linguistics, especially looking at how corpora have been, what kind of corpora have been developed, because of course that's really relevant for the study of how words combine together. That corpora being large collections of electronic text, they allow us to understand the behavior of words really in their code text. We have done it a few times during the seminars, so now we see like how how the development of different corpora allows us to understand better the behavior of words. So let's take a look at the American School of Linguistics first. So we have two important figures. The first one, I'm sure you know, Noam Chomsky, because he's famous also outside linguistics as a political, commentator. But of course, for us, it's relevant like his activity as a linguist. And out of you may remember that I talked about Bloomfield, the structuralist linguist, and out of his school, which was very much focused on, structure, came Noam Chomsky, who introduced generative grammar, then called transformational grammar, and then universal grammar. Universal grammar is, you may have heard of it because it's a very famous notion. So the main idea of Chomsky is that language is inborn, and that all the different national grammars that we know, like the cases of Lithuania, the grammar of English, and all the other grammars, they're just surface realizations of something deeper, a bit like, how can I say, different frames, but the sun behind is the same. So that's the idea. There is a universal grammar underlying all the surface realizations of national grammars. But of course, the very formalistic idea of Chomsky implied that he paid attention only to syntax and structure. So combinability was a matter of, rules and generative principles, how to form, like what are the switches, the requirements to form negative sentences, passive sentences, and so on. So what's a common core that really all languages in terms of structure would share beyond the surface differences that all of us can easily see and witness. However, another linguist, basically born almost like the same year as Chomsky, Charles Fillmore, he contended that combinability can't be understood outside meaning. So that's a big difference. So in Charles Fillmore's, it was like one of the founder, if not the founder, of cognitive linguistics. He proposed case grammar and frame semantics, and we will see more of his theory like later on during his presentation, but for the moment we can say that apart from syntactic roles, the combinability of words depends on their semantic roles. So for instance, like roles such as patient, agent, or instrument, they tend to have specific they tend to have specific syntactic realizations, such as, we know that usually the patient is realized in grammar as a direct or as an indirect object, and the agent as the subject, and so on. So basically, he stated that to understand how words behave syntagmatically, it's important to understand the semantic role that they carry. So that's, is interesting because even though this is the American School of Linguistics, which started cognitive linguistics, there are also interesting parallels with the notion of transitivity that has been developed in the British School of Linguistics, to which I now move. The British School of Linguistics has its main proponent possibly in Halliday, an important linguist who died a few years ago, and he is a proponent of systemic functional grammar. He was a disciple of Firth. Firth, you remember, I mentioned him at the beginning of the lexicology course by saying that, for him, meaning is use, and words by the company it keeps. So Halliday developed his ideas into a full-blown theory of grammar that is really based on context, on the situation. So, the notion of language for Halliday is not simply like a mental phenomenon or a structural one, is rather a social phenomenon. So like the way words are combined together really is a reflection of communication needs and the contextual and situational constraints or possibilities as well. And of course, the way of reasoning, Halliday has been super influential also in the approach or school or discipline known as corpus linguistics. Because of course, in systemic functional grammar, there is already a lot of emphasis on word combinability. And of course, the tool that has been used to kind of validate the claims made by systemic functional grammar come from corpus data, so from naturally occurring language. That has always been, some kind of a problem for more abstract theoretical approaches such as Chomsky's, who would simply, provide invented examples because he would trust the intuition of native speakers. But we know that even the intuition of native speakers can sort of, betray us sometimes, because language is much more vast than even the knowledge of native speakers. that the knowledge native speakers may have of it. So meaning is used is also used in a way in Halliday's theory. And of course, as I said, the corpus development is really in depth. Also, of course, to technological advancement, but the theoretical underpinning are all in systemic functional linguistics as developed by Halliday. Let's remind some important figures of corpus linguistics, such as Sinclair, Stubbs, Carter, who, by the way, was teaching at University of Nottingham, where I where I was studying for my PhD. So he was an important figure. He died a few years ago. Okay. Now, enough for the sort of historical background of the linguistic, of the linguistics history, and let's move on to context. So the central notion that kind of is behind this idea of combinability. So therefore, context is a polysemous word, like many other words. You remember that 50% of the words are polysemous in the English language. Context is especially polysemous because, even within linguistics, it has been used in different senses. So let's see them. One sense is the surrounding utterances, and usually we refer to this kind of context as the co-text. Okay, so remember this term co-text. It means basically the words, expressions, and utterances that are kind of physically around the word or expression that we are analyzing. So it's a purely linguistic phenomenon, okay? And the purely syntagmatic one is what we can see or hear in the immediate proximity of the word that we are taking into consideration. Another sense of situation of context is the physical situation. So for instance, like now the situation is me talking to you, recording this lecture like in my office, using a laptop and using PowerPoint to record this lecture. So and you listening from your homes or from somewhere else. So that would be the context. Of course, ours is a split context, but it's an immediate physical environment or situation. Another sense is the wider situation, which usually is referred to as discourse, which is not simply the context that I described before, but is also, how to say, it includes social relationships, such as, I'm a lecturer, you're a student, you're studying for, to get a degree eventually, but now for your own sake, like to gain knowledge and also to pass the exam and so on. So whatever, when we add the physical situation like social relationships and also power relationships, such as my right as a professor to talk for a lot of time, or at least like during lectures, that's part of discourse. And or you will know soon that there are many branches in applied linguistics, especially discourse analysis and critical discourse analysis, that places a lot of emphasis on the analysis of power relationships. So who has the floor, how long they speak for, how likely a speaker is to interrupt another one based on his social positions and so on. So when we take into account all these factors, we don't simply speak about the situation, but we tend to refer to this context as discourse. And the other sort of sense is the background knowledge. So the knowledge context as the knowledge assumed to be shared between speaker and hearer. So this is known as background or encyclopedic knowledge. So as you see, like some of these senses sort of overlap. So I may have chosen like another visual representation of that, such as overlapping shapes. However, at the same time, they can be, they can be teased apart. Okay, And for what matters combinability, we basically focus on the linguistic context, okay? So once we have a linguistic context, a sequence of words, and see like the relationship across them, one of the main notions is that of valency. Valency is the capacity, can be defined as the capacity of verbs to attract other elements, and is a term that is borrowed from physics. Now, of course, you know, or you remember, like in physics, some elements have more power to attract other elements, and you can see here, you know, like hydrogen and other elements. Now I don't remember, so don't inquire about my very scarce knowledge of physics, but you may remember is a term that comes from physics. So the capacity of elements to form bonds with other elements, which is variable across, you know, according to several factors. We can see something very similar in linguistics when we focus on verbs. Let's give some examples. So some verbs, and let's read the first sentence, would be her children's clothes disappeared. So if we look at the verb disappeared, we see that this verb only needs a subject, you know, her children's clothes. So of course it wouldn't make sense if I only said disappeared, because you would be asking who. But then if I provide a subject, it's enough. I mean, the sentence is grammatically correct. Of course, I can add some optional elements, some adjuncts, as for instance, disappeared the other day or yesterday, but these elements are optional, so they're not sort of part of the valency of verbs. You know, we can say that disappear and many other verbs are monovalent, like they only take one argument. The argument is the element that they attract. In this case, the subject is the argument, okay? So, you know, another specific kind of monovalent verbs would be, you know, verbs referring to weather, such as rains, or it rains, or it snows, where still we do need a dummy subject, such as it, but we don't need any other argument for the sentence to make sense grammatically and also semantically. However, other verbs are different. For instance, the verb to write tends to take two arguments, or at least two arguments. So if I say I wrote a letter, wrote, of course it needs a subject, who is writing, but then you also need the object, what's being written. So I wrote a letter. Of course, you know, there are optional elements that we can add. I wrote a letter to my sister, for instance. But it would be, you know, kind of strange to simply say I wrote or I'm writing. Of course, you know, some contexts may sort of allow that. You know, if someone is calling and saying, sorry, I'm writing, but well, we would simply say I'm writing something. You know, we have a feeling, well, or we can say like I like writing, but that's a bit different. But in most contexts, the verb to write would require two arguments, and the second argument would be the direct object. And of course, you remember from your course in grammar, we call these verbs transitive, because they take a direct object. So that's the idea of transitivity that is really closely linked to that of valency. And of course, you know, in disappear, because there is no sub-object being taken, we can say that the verb is intransitive. And then we have also polyvalent verbs, such as to bring, you know, or to make in some context. So for instance, the paintings have brought her international fame. We can't simply say the paintings have brought, because we say brought what, but also to whom. If we say the paintings have brought her, that's it, it doesn't make sense. The sentence would be incomplete, because even two arguments would not be enough for the verb to bring. So we need all the three arguments being paintings, so the subject, her, the indirect object, and international fame the direct object. Okay, so to bring would be a trivalent verb, with three, or polyvalent, just because three or more arguments. Now I can't think of any verbs that can, having more than three arguments, but the important thing is that the notion of valency, as you can see, it's important because we see how the central node of the verb sort of organizes, arranges the words around it. They all depend on the verb. So we can even sort of show them with a syntactic tree, with the verb as a central node and the other parts as depending on it, which is also why the notions of valency also developed into dependency grammar, like what's the head of the sentence and the rest of it sort of depends on it. So actually we can show, I hope you can see here, I can't, for some reason, it's the first time I'm, sort of recording, so I'm aware that my face is covering some of the contents, and I apologize for that, but you can easily imagine like what's behind me, what's behind the my face. It's the international fame part in this sort of diagram. Okay, so this diagram shows you that really her paintings, her and international fames, they depend on the central verb had brought. So there is an argument by means of which is the verb the center of the sentence, not the subject. Okay. Okay. Now, coming back to the contribution of Charles Fillmore, he proposed case theory, so a theory of semantic cases or roles that has been very influential. And let's first, read these sentences and comment on how it works. So we have three sentences that are sort of similar in the event they construe, but of course it's construed in different ways. The first sentence would be John opened the door with the key. Second one would be the key opened the door, and the third one, the door opened. As you see, like the central core meaning of the sentence is the same. There is a door that opens. However, as we go to the bottom of the slide, there is less and less explicit information being provided. However, let's look at the breakdown of syntax and semantics. Okay, if we take the first sentence, John opened the door with a key. Of course, we see that from the perspective of the syntactic level, John is a subject. The door, well, of course, open is the verb, so the predicate we'll call it. The door is a direct object, and with the key would be adverbial. You may remember these notions from your course in grammar in the first semester. At the level of semantics, though, John is the agent because he's the one doing the action. So it's not really true, the agent is a semantic category, the subject is a syntactic category. And in this case, they coincide. John is the subject of the sentence because he's in subject position. We know that the subject position is before the verb. Because, of course, if we say the key opens the door, the key becomes the subject, right? We agree on that. However, semantically, the key would never be the agent because it lacks the capacity to initiate an action. And this is, of course, a semantic issue and kind of rests on encyclopedic knowledge. Okay, only like a willful creature can open a door, so only John in this sentence could be the agent. The door would be the patient, like the entity upon which this action is being sort of carried out, and with the key would be the instrument. Okay. Yeah, as you may simply think like also thinking of case in Lithuanian, the use of suffixes indexed in different cases, you know, say sukrumi and so on. Umi would be sort of a company, so it would have a very clear semantic or functional rather than syntactic role. Okay. Now the important thing here is to notice that the key, you know, well, from the viewpoint of syntax, you know, the elements can be scrambled. The key can be the subject, or it can be an adverbial, okay, or it can even be, you know, omitted at all. The door in the first sentence is a direct object. In the second sentence also, but in the third sentence it becomes a subject. However, when we look at the semantic roles, they don't change. John, whenever we have John, is always the agent. The door is always the patient, and the keys, wherever we find them, they're always the the instrument. No, sorry, in this case, there is a mistake here. I made a mistake. The key, open the door, the key would be instrument. So I apologize for that, okay? So there is a mistake here on my slide, okay? So semantic roles, they don't sort of, partly they are independent of syntactic roles. So there is a distinction between them, and this distinction has been noticed, as I said, and developed by Fillmore, who thereby initiated a different sort of strand of grammar and linguistics as compared to Noam Chomsky. So beware. Semantics roles, as I said, are independent of syntactic ones, even though, of course, there is correlation. Of course, we say that in most cases, the subject corresponds to the agent, which is why I also like my mistake on the slide, because it's an automatic association, but it's not a necessary one, because there is a degree of autonomy between the two levels. Now, case theory developed into another theory, like a full-blown frame semantics. Frame semantics is a more complex and contextual theory of meaning and word combinability. I provided a link. I'm not sure I can open this link with the presentation mode, but you can do that, okay, to double check, because there is a website called FrameNet, where a huge amount of text has been tagged based on frame semantic theory, okay? So, but let's see what FrameNet is. I apologize, maybe not super clear to read, like on the slide. But as I said, it's a large database of English that has already been tagged for semantic roles, so it's a very useful linguistic resource, and I encourage you to kind of explore this website. As you see here, more than 200,000 context has been manually tagged, and it has resulted in publications and basically the application of frame semantics to naturally occurring data. But let's look more clearly like how is frame semantic applied, how it works. So the idea of frame semantics is that one word calls like a network of knowledge. So basically what is also known as script, schemata, or model, or mental model. So for instance, we have the frame of risk. So whenever we're talking about risk, we are evoking in our mind a set of related notions, such as the presence of a protagonist, of a bad outcome, of a decision that needs to be taken, of a goal, optionally of a setting, and also possession and source. Now, let's take a simple sentence to see how frame semantics can be applied to natural occurring discourse. So basically we are doing the same thing that we can see in FrameNet, only that FrameNet, of course, tagged 200,000 examples of a natural occurring language. So why should he risk his life to try to save Brooks? Okay, so this is the sentence. Now, of course, we know that if we can analyze it in different ways. We can analyze it syntactically, we can analyze it semantically, by saying that, these words belong to this or that semantic domain and so on. However, with frame semantics, we try to kind of subsume the whole sentence into just one frame, which is the frame of risk. And we see that because, of course, we have the key verb risk, so that sort of prompts the frame really, like as a frame, as an element that orders the context. We have a protagonist, so a subject, but of course we call it a protagonist here. His life would be the possession, what's at risk, and we have a goal to try to save Brooks. So of course we have, in this sentence, we can tag he, his life, and to try to save Brooks with general category, and as you see, they are written like in capital letters, as always customary for semantic notions. And this can be easily mapped onto, the kind of list of elements, for the risk frame. Okay. Of course, different frames, they have different kinds of elements, but this is a way sort of to make sense of, it's a bottom-up, it's a top-down approach to language, if you like, because we try to derive, we try to see how a sentence derives from a general frame, so from a general idea. So here, the idea of risk, okay, that brings with it a sort of, a specific arrangement. And of course, once you analyze all context of risk, you would see this recurring pattern, these recurring semantic patterns, that they are in a way evoked by the verb to risk, or maybe synonymous verbs. So you see, in a way, it's a way to expand, to broaden the notion of valency. Okay. Only that valency is more structural, and frame is more conceptual. Now, finally, let's move on to the meat of our talk. Like, after this theoretical introduction, we can move on to the notion of combinability. Okay, so first of all, well, I apologize, it will become clear why these icons, but as you easily guess, some combinations are allowed and some are not. So that's why you see these icons here, the thick and the crosses. So first of all, we may distinguish between lexical and grammatical combinability, even though really there is more of a continuum between them. Lexical combinability often is semantically motivated. For instance, to read a book, we would find the same combination basically in all languages. Scritti di kniga, leggere un libro, to read a book, leggere un libro, and so on. So also to write a book, this combination, they would depend on extra linguistic or encyclopedic knowledge. So it will be sort of independent from the specific language we are focusing on. So if we take fly a book, it would not work in any language, apart from some examples in Duolingo. If you ever tried Duolingo, it's pretty funny. There is even like some memes about Duolingo, like a person answering like in very strange language to natural occurring conversation because the person studied on Duolingo. And sorry for this digression, but I remember I was using Duolingo a few years ago to kind of revamp my knowledge of Hungarian, a language that I studied quite a lot of years ago now. And some of the sentences were hilarious. They looked like, lines from surrealist poems. So so basically what happened, yeah, I mean, but apart from say Duolingo and surrealist poetry and maybe fairy tales, we would not accept like a combination such as to fly a book, just because there is too much semantic distance between the verb and the noun. Okay, so my general point is that some combinations are not really working, not because of some internal constraints in the language, but rather because of, you know, physical impossibilities. So some ontological, existential impossibilities. We know that book don't, I mean, you can throw a book, but book don't fly. I mean, they can only fly metaphorically. When it comes to grammatical combinability, however, is much more conventional. We know that the correct sequence in English is to have like determiner plus noun. We can't have really book the, so that's the combination that works, or to look at. So of course we need to kind of learn to look at, to pick up, and so on, as if they were, actually they are lexical units on their own right. You know, of course they would be formed of two orthographic words. You remember when we were discussing the definition of words at the beginning of the course. However, they really work like one unit. And this is why, you know, phrasal verbs, for instance, or the use of prepositions are so challenging for, you know, L2 speakers of a language, because it's just a matter of, often is a matter of conventionality. I mean, there might be some iconic motivation, you know, like when I look up at someone or look down on someone. However, quite often, you know, the use is pretty conventional. So the only way is to kind of practice, listen, and remember. And of course, we know that some combinations are really not allowed in the language, like the, by, for instance. Like a combination of, you know, we know syntactically that a determiner can't precede a preposition. Okay, so lexical and grammatical combinability. I hope that's clear. However, we will see that lexical combinability is not only dependent on external constraints, but also has internal constraints, you know, that we will see that we say rancid butter or stale bread, but not vice versa, even though, you know, the same extra linguistic idea of something not fresh, not good, is valid for both of them. So of course there is a way each language sort of creates its own more likely association words. So let's take a look at the lexical combinability, or I would also say, you know, collocability of the verbs to win and to gain. And this is useful for those of you working on synonymy, like for a research task, because you know that synonyms are not only, you know, different in terms of, you know, meaning, connotation, register, but often also in terms of their collocational range or combinability. So they don't take the same, say the verb doesn't take, now we're talking about verbs, and say the verbs, they don't take the same arguments. So for instance, we can win an argument, we can win a battle, we can win a victory, we can win a vote. Gain, we can't really gain a battle. See here, battle has got the asterisk that indicates that something is not allowed in the language. However, we can gain access to something, we can gain points, or we can gain a victory. So some, you know, victory, you can gain or win a victory. So here in this context, we can use them pretty much as synonyms, but not in the others, because they you know, they have a different collocational range as words. And of course, this pattern now seems to be easy to take it for granted, but it has been allowed only clearly with the emergence of corpus data, because sometimes, as I said, our intuition of how likely a sentence, a word combination, is likely to be may not be correct, even as native speakers. And of course, this is even more true with a language as international as English, with so many varieties, that makes virtually impossible to kind of be sure all the kinds of words combination that are allowed, apart from the maybe more general ones. As I said, the combinability may be also language specific, and this is an easy and clear example. The words tall in English is applied to people. However, the translation into Italian or Lithuanian, alto, aukštas, not only applies to people or to building, but also to fever. And now I don't remember how to say fever in Lithuanian, I'm sorry. But we can say febbre alta in Italian. Aukštas sienas, this I remember. We can say un muro alto, but we really don't say a tall wall or a tall fever. We say a high fever, high wall. So of course here we see that, as any translator knows, tall, if you are translating into English, of course you need to, the same word in Lithuanian is translated in different ways according to the context in English. So there is no one-to-one relationship between the word in Lithuanian and the word in English, for instance, and vice versa. Two different words in English may have the same translation in Lithuanian, just because that's the way word combinability works in that language. So we say aukštas žmogus arba sakim aukštas sienas. Now imagine like an imaginary applause for me trying to talk Lithuanian. No kidding. It's the minimum after 5 years and a half living here in Vilnius. Now, combinability is a continuum, and sometimes we can kind of lose track of that. But if you think of, on the one hand, free word combinations, and on the other hand, idioms, you see what I mean, right? So at the one end of the spectrums, as I said, we have idioms. Idioms are fixed because they behave a bit like words or lexical units. Usually we can't change them. I mean, we say to kick a bucket, but we can't say to kick something else, or we can't say to jump on a bucket. We can't really modify them, right? There is only like some degrees of modification, like we can change the inflection, we can make the plural, the future or past tense, but we can't really change the morphological form of the idiom. Birds of a feather flock together. We can't say, animals of a feather or birds of something else. They are fixed combinations. So they're fixed, and also they are not really compositional. You remember the idea of compositionality is that the meaning can be deduced from each part. However, that's often not the case with idioms, because you remember idioms are semantically opaque. When we say don't beat around the bush, there is no reason why, delaying something or not being, fast in taking decision or not going straight to the point has directly to do with a bush. So we need some contextual encyclopedic knowledge to make sense of them. And of course, they are not predictable for the same reason that they're not compositional, right? So they need to be learned separately. So take the example of white lie. You look great today, when it's, just said not to offend the other person, or, to tell a white lie. So of course here white doesn't have nothing to do directly with the color white, but it has sort of a, general symbolic meaning of, not wanting to hurt someone. It might be easier for some speakers to remember white lie because there might be the same construction, the same combination in other languages. For instance, in Italian we say bugia bianca. A bit less fixed compositional, a bit less fixed, sorry, and a bit more predictable and a bit more compositional are collocations. So collocations are sequences like mutual preferences of words such as stale bread or heavy smokers. We'll see some other examples later on. But as we can see here, it's not totally opaque, it's not totally metaphorical. However, at the same time, there is no reason why, I mean, we can't say a powerful smoker, or why we say like heavy rain, but we don't say like powerful rain, for instance. So collocations are mutual preference, co-occurrences of words that happen with higher than chance probability. Okay, but I will give you later on like a more technical definition of it. Now what matters is the gradability of combinability. Close to free combinations is like white mouse, for instance. It's a mouse that is, kind of whitish, even though it doesn't need to be super white. But it's clear that it's almost fully compositional, and so white mouse would be close to being like a free word combination. And then we have totally free combinations, such as white shirt, for instance. So is a shirt that is white, and these are predictable, compositional, and free rather than fixed, because of course we can modify them, and we have different sort of phrases. Okay, so again, we're talking about how to distinguish phrase, like what we said about distinguishing phrases from compounds also holds for distinguishing free phrases from idioms, and partly also from collocations that tend to be kind of in between idioms and free combinations. So let's see like what a combination is. Can be defined as the statistically significant tendency for two words to occur together. It is also known as mutual expectancy or habitual association. And of course, these are alternative terms that you can find, for instance, in Jackson and Zianvela. If an L2 speaker of English says stale eggs, rancid bread, or addle butter, it would be understood. I mean, people would look at him like, okay, that's a strange way to express yourself. But I mean, unless you are dumb or you want to really not to help the other person, not to be cooperative, you would understand the notion, right? Because we said that collocations tend to be partly transparent, so it's clear that even these wrong combinations, they would indicate products that are produce that is not fresh. Okay, of course we know that we say rancid butter, stale bread, and addled eggs. So there is a strong expectancy, mutual expectancy, for stale to go with bread and rancid with butter, and so on. Of course, the interesting thing here is that this is not a symmetrical relationship, right? Because stale only collocates with bread and maybe a few other words, but bread collocates with a lot of words, right? To eat bread, to cook bread, to make bread, and so on. So like usually in a collocation, one term as kind of a more collocate, so it's more open-ended, and the other one is much more restricted. So it almost only makes sense within that given collocation, or in a few collocations that can be even learned by heart. Okay. Yeah, so we can also take the example of to make a decision. That's also like a collocation. However, again, decision has a wider collocational range than than stale or rancid or adult, because we can say take a decision, make a decision, arrive at a decision, and so on. So even in collocations, they are not, not all collocations they show the same strengths of bond between the two elements. Okay. So in other words, they can be more or less fixed. To make a decision is not super fixed because we can replace it with to take a decision. However, rancid butter is pretty much fixed. That's, you can learn it as an expression on its own. So now let's go on to a even more technical definition that has been given by Halliday. You remember the important linguist that I mentioned at the beginning, and Collip. So they defined collocation as the habitual, meaningful co-occurrence of two or more words that are known as a note word and is collocate or collocates in close proximity to each other. So close proximity, they don't need to be super proximal. There can be even a few words inserted in between, but they need to be in the same context. Okay. It is, as a lexical relationship, collocation can be defined quantitatively as the degree to which the probability of a word y occurring in text is increased by the presence of another word x. Okay. So if we see bread, well, if we see stale, we probably will see also bread. We can kind of predict what will come next. Okay. You can even like prepare like a a fill in the gaps exercise, probing students' knowledge of collocations. Okay, what do you expect? What's the next word that will come? Some examples, but really there are hundreds, if not thousands actually thousands for sure of examples. Above average, abuse of power to achieve a goal, an active volcano, an awful lot, to strike a deal, and so on. Okay, so of course if we see lot, we may expect awful maybe to occur, and vice versa. If we see volcano, if we see volcano, we probably see, imagine active, as a word that has strong potential to occur in the language. Okay, and with average above or below average, for instance. Okay. And of course, when teaching, is a very good idea, rather than teaching individual words, to teach collocations, to teach longer sequences, because it has been found out that a lot of our language is prefabricated. So otherwise, we would not be able, especially like native speakers, but also fluent speakers of L2, whenever we say nice to meet you, we don't need to think of the sequence. We hold this sequence as a whole in our memory. So it works almost as a word itself. Okay, so this may seem obvious to us, but it was not so obvious 40-50 years ago, before the advent, the emergence of corpus linguistics, that really kind of highlighted these usual patterns. Let's take another example of collocability, the example of kith and kin. This is a collocation that it means friends and family, with kith meaning friends and kin meaning family. However, the interesting thing, as you can see from this sort of diagram, is that kith is not really, doesn't make sense on its own. It only makes sense when we kind of look at it from the perspective of kin. So we can say that the collocation range of kith is very limited. We basically only make sense in that expression kith and kin. We can't use it on its own. However, kin is a word with many more possibilities, many more collocates. As a note word, it has more collocates. So we can say next of kin, we can say a close kin, we can say kin relationships, or we can say between kin. So others as well, but these are some of the most common collocations that you find out if you key in kin in any corpus of English. Yeah, so this is just a reminder of what I already said. Okay. So kin is more autonomous, it has more power, we can say, than kith. So it's easier to derive like a general abstract meaning for kin than for kith, because kith is totally context dependent and kin transcends its own context. So that's why we can, more easily provide a definition for kin than we can for kith. If you define kith, you always have to, to propose to report like the kin and kith collocation. But not vice versa. You can define kin without reporting kith and kin. And again, a reminder that according to, well, depends of course on the linguists we are reading, but collocability, combinability, idiomaticity, they sometimes tend to be used interchangeably, okay? Let's look at another example of collocational range or collocability, taking into account sensitive versus sensible, because these two words can be easily confused, but their meaning as synonyms only kind of emerge when we consider the typical collocates they have. Okay, so on the one hand we have sensitive areas, information, skin, issue, and so on. On the other we have sensible, shoes, people, advice, person, idea, and so on. So what we can see here is that there is a difference in combinability pattern. Okay, so on the one, we can say, for instance, we can say a sensitive skin, and not, but we say, sorry, a sensible skin, a sensitive skin, I apologize, but we can't say a sensible skin, and we can't say a sensitive advice. So of course we can sort of draw the conclusion that sensible has to do more with ideas and sensitive with sort of physical reactions. However, as you see, like some words that are very semantically vague, such as way or person, may collocate both with sensible and sensitive. So that's why it's important to, to understand the context when we are, say, translating that into another language. A sensible way and a sensitive way are not the same. But of course, this collocate way is shared across them. For your knowledge, I mean, almost kind of, paving the way to lexicography, among the many dictionaries that we find, there are specialized dictionaries such as the Oxford Collocations Dictionary. And here is an entry. You can find it also online at the link that I provide you in this slide. If you write brand, it gives you a list of collocates. So that's very useful, for writing. We know that bread collocates with a list of adjectives such as fresh, hard, soggy, stale. Our stale, for instance, crusty, sliced, homemade, home-baked, garlic, you name them. Then also it collocates with quantities, a loaf of bread, a chunk of bread, crumbs of bread, and so on. So we know that these words, they sort of create a network around bread. Also, there are some verbs that collocate with bread, such as to bake or to make, to slice, to cut bread, to spread something on bread. So like these are all collocates, and the note word would be bread in this context, of course. Also prepositions, it would be on the bread. We would not say in the bread or at the bread. So basically we say that bread would not take this kind of preposition as their collocates, as its collocates. And then some phrases such as bread and butter or bread and cheese and so on, so we find often bread and water. So collocation dictionary, as we see, we're not given a definition. We're not given synonyms. We're given really words that have a higher than chance likelihood to occur in the code text. Okay, so around around basically. Now let's moving on to idioms. A technical definition of idioms is a type of fixed expression in which the meaning can't be deduced from the meanings of functions of different parts of the expression, as with the idiom kick someone's upstairs, meaning to move someone to what seems to be a more important post, but with the motive of removing them from the current post. Yeah, so examples are to spill the beans, to kick the bucket, larger than life, on cloud nine, over the moon, give it a whirl. So we see that all these, all of these are idioms because they don't have, their meaning can't be deduced from the single parts they have. Okay, and as we said, they are fixed. We can't change them apart. We can't say on cloud 5, for instance, or we can't say on sky 9. So they are fixed. Maybe it's interesting, like to record and to report like this, little anecdote by Halliday, saying that not long ago, just to show like an idiom that even a native speaker such as Halliday would not know because he was living in Australia, but he was not originally from there. So he said, not long ago, I was walking out of a particularly complicated car park in Canberra when a car pulled up beside me. The driver asked me if I could point him towards the exit, any exit, and added that it being 2 words, they'd been driving around the car park for some time and had done more miles than Burke and Wills. So more miles than Burke and Wills. That's the idiom. Halliday had. Now I'm not sure whether I had ever heard that phrase before, and I don't recognize is a familiar Australian idiom, but I do know that Burke and Wills were explorers who undertook an ambitious journey across Australia from south to north and back again, but died of starvation before completing the expedition. So probably the man assumed this, background knowledge that Halliday, however, didn't have. So, that sort of shows that you need background knowledge as well, in this context to understand idioms. Now I'm gonna finish this this presentation with a brief history of corpus linguistics, like a few how to say, a few corpora that have been developed, in the past more than 50 years. Actually 60 years, time flies. So in 1959 there was a survey of English usage, a data collection that formed the backbone for the grammar, the comprehensive English grammar by Quirk, the Brown corpus in 1964, and then, 14 years later, the Lancaster Oslo Bergen corpus, the LOB corpus, and in 1987 the Colin Colby language corpus project. So, and of course since then many other projects, because corpus linguistics is an extremely, how to say, prosperous and thriving area in linguistics. The Brown corpus is American and the LOB corpus is British, but they have been matched so as they have the same structure basically, for an easier comparison. So you can see that they are formed of 500 text or samples, and these samples are from different categories or different genres, from editorial, reviews, religion, letters, fiction, science fiction, and so on. And as you see, like, the number has been matched so as to allow like a more balanced representation of different varieties of American and British English. Of course, now the more common and famous corpora, general corpora, are the BNC and the Coca corpus that sometimes we do use also during the seminars. Apart from that, you may want to have a look at some specialized corpora, such as the Corpus of Historical American English, COHA, the London Land Corpus of Spoken English, the Michigan Corpus of Academic Spoken English, and the International Corpus of Learned Language. As you see here, like different varieties of English are represented by these corpora. So corpora are not just there to represent general English, even though this is what BNC and COCA do, but also, you know, historical English or spoken English or academic English or English spoken by non-native speakers. So of course you can establish like a specific language variety and build a corpus based on that. And for today, I'm done. I hope you enjoyed the lecture. Thanks for your gentle, from your kind attention. I hope that Mr. Strike and Mrs. Blow, to strike a blow, won't be jealous about to strike a deal. And yeah, you can easily kind of understand the meaning of the other idioms, represented here, so I don't need to remind them of you, but maybe I think for today I spilled all my beans. Bye guys, see you see you next week at the seminars. Remember, there is no class on Monday because of Easter, okay? So no lecture on Monday. Bye everyone.